The morning of April 18, 1942, broke cold and hard over the western Pacific. A pale light bled into a restless sky, tracing the low, steel-colored swells that rocked the American carrier task force. Wind whipped over the deck of USS Hornet, CV-8, a vessel already heavy with the weight of an unprecedented mission. Across her length, the flight deck was crowded not with the Navy's own stubby blue-gray fighters and dive bombers, but with 16 long, khaki-finished B-25B Mitchell medium bombers, Army aircraft that had never before attempted what was about to happen. For the men who had spent the last 2 weeks steaming westward from San Francisco, secrecy had been their constant companion. Even among the 1,200 sailors of the Hornet, most had been told little. Beyond that, they were carrying Army bombers somewhere across the Pacific. They had trained for neither this load nor this purpose. To them, the presence of twin-engine aircraft, each weighing over 10 tons when fully loaded, was an alien sight on a carrier deck built for much lighter planes. Beneath those bombers lay a gamble so audacious that many of the men involved quietly doubted its chances of success. The plan had been crafted in the aftermath of disaster. Just 133 days earlier, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay shattered at Pearl Harbor. Battleships still sat on the harbor floor, their superstructures twisted, their decks scorched. Japan's war machine had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies in a lightning advance. For the American public, hope was scarce. President Franklin Roosevelt and his military chiefs sought not only a tangible blow against the Japanese Empire, but a strike that would send a clear message, to friend and foe alike, that the United States could and would carry the war to the enemy's doorstep. This morning's mission was that message. The architect was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, an aviator whose career already spanned the transformation of flight from fragile wood and fabric craft to fast, all-metal bombers. Doolittle had been tasked with leading an operation that combined two branches of the U.S. military in a way never before attempted, launching medium bombers from the deck of a Navy carrier, striking targets on the Japanese home islands, and then continuing westward to land in nationalist-held China. It was an operation of enormous risk. The B-25s had been heavily modified, excess armament removed, fuel tanks added, bombs carefully selected for weight and effect. Each aircraft would carry 4 500-pound bombs, some general-purpose high explosives, others incendiaries, to strike industrial and military targets in and around Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The crews, drawn from volunteer units, had trained at Eglin Field, Florida, for weeks, under conditions designed to mimic the impossibly short takeoff run of a carrier deck. Navy Lieutenant Henry L. Miller had taught Army pilots how to coax their bombers into the air in less than 500 feet. Even so, none had practiced the launch with the wind of the open sea, the pitch of a warship, or the stakes of enemy territory ahead. The task force, designated Task Force 16, had steamed under constant threat of detection. It comprised the Hornet and her escorts, plus the veteran carrier USS Enterprise, CV-6, under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey. The Enterprise carried the fighter and scout planes that would guard the bombers during the approach. Together, the two carriers and their screen of cruisers and destroyers had pushed further toward Japan than any American surface fleet had yet dared. The original plan called for launching the bombers about 450 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, striking their targets in daylight, and then pressing on toward the Chinese mainland to land after nightfall. Every calculation had been made on a knife's edge, with fuel loads, wind speed, and deck length all dictating the narrow margin between success and failure. At 07:38 that morning, that margin vanished. The Hornet's lookouts sighted a small Japanese vessel, picket boat number 23, later identified as the Nito Maru, on the horizon. It was part of a string of early warning craft deployed by the Japanese Navy to detect any approaching threat. A cruiser from the American screen opened fire, and the vessel was quickly sunk, but not before sending a radio warning. Halsey and Doolittle knew instantly that their presence was compromised. The decision was swift. Instead of launching at the planned range, the bombers would have to take off immediately, over 650 nautical miles from Tokyo. This meant every aircraft would face a fuel crisis. The extra 200 miles would likely make it impossible to reach the intended airfields in China before nightfall. Many crews would be forced to crash land or bail out over unknown terrain. As Doolittle later recalled, "We had no choice. If we didn't go then, we wouldn't go at all." Below decks, crews strapped themselves into their bombers. The men moved through final checklists with a precision that masked their apprehension. In the nose of each Mitchell, bomb bays held their deadly cargo. Fuel tanks brimmed with high-octane gasoline. Engines thrummed with restrained power. On the carrier deck, sailors lined the catwalks, faces tense against the cold wind. At 08:20, with Hornet's bow pointed into a 23-knot wind and her engines driving hard against the swell, the first bomber was moved into position. This was Doolittle's own aircraft, B-25B number 40-2344. He stood at the controls, visor low over his eyes, scanning the painted white line that marked his takeoff path. Behind him, the deck crew signaled readiness. Forward, the ocean rose and fell, its horizon lost in a haze of spray. The signal came. Doolittle pushed the throttles forward, the Wright R2600 twin Cyclone engines roaring to full power. The Mitchell surged ahead, tires rumbling over the wooden deck. Spray exploded from the bow as the Hornet plunged into a trough, shortening the visible runway to almost nothing. At the last moment, the bomber lifted free of the deck, wheels brushing the crest of a wave before clawing into the open air. One by one, the other 15 aircraft followed. Pilots timed their runs with the ship's heave, releasing brakes at the upward pitch to gain every possible foot of lift. Deck crews sprinted to chalk and clear for each takeoff, the scent of burnt fuel mingling with salt spray. The last bomber, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, lifted away just after 09 o'clock. Out over the Pacific, the formation broke into individual paths, each crew flying low to avoid detection. The bombers were widely spaced to confuse Japanese radar and to strike multiple targets nearly simultaneously. In the cockpits, men scanned for enemy patrols, adjusted throttles for fuel economy, and felt the gnawing uncertainty of what lay ahead. Hours later, Tokyo lay under a clear spring sky. For its citizens, the air raid sirens that began to wail shortly before noon were an almost unheard-of sound. The Japanese home islands had been untouched by enemy aircraft for the entirety of the war. The Imperial Navy's victories had seemed to place them beyond reach. Now, sudden shadows passed over rooftops, followed by the distant thump of explosions. Doolittle's bomber approached from the east, skimming low over the water before turning inland. His target was an industrial district, factories producing military equipment, docks crowded with supply vessels. At 1,500 feet, his crew released their bombs, watching plumes of smoke and fire rise against the skyline. Below, Startled civilians pointed skyward. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black bursts marking the air, but the bombers pressed on. Elsewhere over the city, the other crews struck in quick succession. Lieutenant Travis Hoover hit oil storage tanks near Tokyo Bay. Captain Edward York targeted a steelworks in Yokohama. Others attacked aircraft factories and shipyards in Nagoya and Kobe. Damage assessments later showed that physical destruction was limited, but the psychological effect was immense. In Tokyo's military headquarters, initial reports were met with disbelief. Aircraft over the capital? Impossible. Yet the evidence was unmistakable. For the first time in centuries, an enemy force had struck the Japanese homeland. By early afternoon, the last bomber had crossed the coast, heading westward toward China. Behind them, smoke still rose over the cities, and the wail of sirens mingled with the distant crackle of fires. For the men of Task Force 16 still at sea, the moment was equally profound. They had watched those bombers lift into the unknown, each a fragile speck heading into enemy territory. None could be recalled, none could be replaced. The gamble was complete. Whether it would pay off, whether any of those crews would return, remained uncertain. As Roosevelt would later tell reporters, the bombers had come from Shangri-La, a whimsical name for an operation that had been anything but fanciful. On this day, in a single stroke, the United States had proven that the Pacific was not Japan's fortress, and that even in the darkest months of the war, audacity could carry the fight to the enemy's very heart. The road to April 18, 1942, began on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft roared over the island of Oahu, unleashing a storm of bombs and torpedoes upon the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. In just over 2 hours, 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans killed. The shock was not confined to the military. Across the continental United States, the news crackled over radios with a sense of unreality. The Pacific, once perceived as a vast protective barrier, had been crossed with devastating effect. By the time the last Japanese planes departed, the balance of power in the Pacific was heavily tilted toward Tokyo. Japan's combined fleet, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, held an unbroken chain of conquests stretching from Manchuria to the edges of the Indian Ocean. American outposts at Wake Island and Guam fell within days. The Philippines, defended by General Douglas MacArthur's forces, were under siege. The mood in Washington was grim. In the opening weeks of 1942, Allied fortunes suffered blow after blow. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, fell to Japanese forces in mid-February, and the Dutch East Indies followed soon after. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, facing both the military disaster and the need to rally a stunned public, pressed his advisors for options. The Navy's Pacific Surface Fleet had been crippled, and even its carriers, intact after Pearl Harbor, were few in number and needed for defensive operations. What Roosevelt wanted was a strike, one that would hit the Japanese homeland itself. Such a blow, he believed, would have both strategic and psychological value, shattering the myth of Japanese invulnerability, boosting American morale, and forcing Japan to divert resources to home defense. The challenge was immense. No Allied airfield lay within bomber range of Tokyo. The distances involved meant that any conventional attack by land-based bombers was impossible without first capturing forward bases, an option months, if not years, away. The Navy could close to within carrier strike range, but its carrier aircraft were small, short-legged fighters and dive bombers, not capable of carrying the heavy bomb load that Roosevelt envisioned for such a symbolic operation. It was in this climate that a suggestion, almost offhand at first, emerged from an unexpected source. In late January 1942, Navy Captain Francis S. Lowe, serving on Admiral Ernest King's staff, visited the carrier USS Hornet at Norfolk. There, he noticed the outlines of a carrier flight deck painted on a nearby airfield for pilot training. On it, Army bombers were practicing short takeoffs. The idea struck him. If Army bombers could take off from a carrier, they might deliver a substantial payload over Japan without the need to return to the ship, flying instead onward to friendly or semi-friendly territory. Lowe brought the concept to King, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet. King, known for his aggressive instincts, saw potential. He arranged for a meeting with General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. The two branches of service, often rivals in both resources and philosophy, found common ground in this bold proposal. Arnold agreed that, if such an operation were possible, it would require a commander with both operational daring and technical expertise. His choice was immediate: Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. Doolittle was already a legend in aviation circles, a pioneering test pilot, a record-setting racer, and one of the few Army officers to hold a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He had flown across the continent in less than 12 hours in 1922, won air races throughout the 1930s, and served as an innovator in instrument flying. In Arnold's words, Doolittle combined brains, courage, and the ability to inspire men. When approached with the concept, launching medium bombers from a carrier deck, striking Japan, and then flying on to China, Doolittle did not hesitate. "It can be done," he told Arnold, "and it will be done." The plan that took shape was as unconventional as it was risky. The aircraft selected, the North American B-25B Mitchell, had a range and bomb capacity superior to carrier aircraft, but was still compact enough to take off from a carrier's deck with the right modifications. Once launched, the bombers would fly to Japan, release their payloads on carefully chosen military and industrial targets, and then continue westward to airfields in China, controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. None of the bombers would return to the carrier. Key to the mission's viability was the element of surprise. The task force would need to approach within roughly 450 nautical miles of Japan before launching. Even then, fuel margins would be razor-thin. Any detection by Japanese patrols could force an early launch and imperil the crew's ability to reach China. The White House quickly approved the concept. Roosevelt himself was enthusiastic, not only for its potential to strike a blow at Japan, but for its political symbolism. The president understood the American public's hunger for action and the morale boost a daring raid could provide. He also understood that such an operation could provoke unpredictable Japanese reactions, something his military advisors considered both a risk and an opportunity. Planning began in February 1942 under the highest classification. Doolittle's first challenge was to find volunteer crews. The call went out quietly among experienced bomber units, with only the vaguest description of the mission. "It will be extremely hazardous," prospective volunteers were told. "Some of you may not come back." Even so, the response was immediate and overwhelming. From the 17th Bomb Group, based at Pendleton Field in Oregon, came the core of the crews that would make history. In the Pentagon's War Plans Division, The operation, soon to be codenamed the First Special Aviation Project, took form. The Navy would provide the carrier and escorting warships. The Army Air Forces would supply and modify the bombers. Coordination between the services was close and, for once, unusually smooth. Arnold and King both recognized the mission's symbolic power, and both shielded it from bureaucratic interference. By early March, modifications to the B-25s were underway at Minneapolis's Wold-Chamberlain Field. The planes were fitted with additional fuel tanks in the bomb bay, crawlway, and lower turret area, increasing capacity to over 1,100 gallons. To save weight, the lower gun turret was removed, and fake wooden guns were installed in the tail to deter enemy fighters. Each aircraft received a carefully balanced bomb load: general-purpose bombs for structural damage, incendiaries for starting fires in industrial areas. As Doolittle oversaw these preparations, another key element of the mission fell into place: training. The crews were sent to Eglin Field, Florida, where a section of runway was marked to match the Hornet's 467-foot flight deck. Under the guidance of Navy pilot Lieutenant Henry L. Miller, they practiced short takeoffs, simulated carrier launches, and refined their navigation for low-level, long-range flights over water. It was here that the men began to grasp the true nature of the mission and the dangers they would face. By the final week of March, the bombers and crews were ready. Doolittle's leadership, the inter-service cooperation, and the urgency driven by Roosevelt's demand for action had brought the operation from concept to execution in just over 2 months, a remarkable feat in wartime. The stage was set for a bold thrust deep into enemy territory, one that would hinge on timing, secrecy, and the ability to adapt to whatever the Pacific might throw in their path. As the bombers were craned onto the deck of USS Hornet at Alameda, California, sailors watched in astonishment. Few had ever seen Army bombers up close, let alone parked on a carrier. The decks were cleared of all Navy aircraft. The Mitchells lashed down in 2 neat rows. Below decks, the crews moved among the sailors, sharing the cramped spaces of a ship bound for the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. From the moment the Hornet slipped her moorings on April 2, 1942, the fate of the mission lay in the balance of secrecy and speed. For those in Roosevelt's circle, the decision to launch the Doolittle raid had been an act of strategic defiance, an assertion that the United States would not remain on the defensive. For the men aboard, it was now a matter of execution. The path from the shock of Pearl Harbor to this point had been swift, almost impossibly so, but the journey ahead would test every calculation, every modification, and every measure of courage. In February 1942, before the Hornet ever pointed her bow toward Japan, the heart of the Doolittle raid was being forged in a remote corner of the Florida Panhandle. The place was Eglin Field, an Army Air Forces training base surrounded by pine forests and bordered by the waters of Choctawhatchee Bay. Here, far from prying eyes, a hand-picked cadre of bomber crews would attempt to solve a problem no one had ever faced: how to launch a fully armed medium bomber from the short, pitching deck of an aircraft carrier. The crews had come from the 17th Bomb Group, men accustomed to long runways and the solid feel of earth beneath their wheels. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, arrived not only with his own aircraft, but with an unwavering belief that the task was possible. It was this confidence, shared sparingly but with conviction, that began to bind the men together. They knew the mission was hazardous. Many suspected it would be one way. Yet the secrecy surrounding it meant that even they did not know their ultimate destination. Doolittle's first challenge was to strip away every margin of error. At Eglin, engineers painted a rectangle on the runway exactly 467 feet long, the length of the Hornet's flight deck. It was a cruelly short stretch for a 31,000-pound bomber. Navy Lieutenant Henry L. Miller, a seasoned carrier pilot, took charge of the takeoff training. Standing beside the painted deck, he instructed the crews on how to wring every ounce of lift from the Mitchell. The technique was as much art as science. Engines had to be brought to full power with brakes locked, flaps set precisely, and control yokes held just right to avoid over-rotating. Timing was critical, releasing the brakes at the right instant, using the full sweep of the wind to claw into the air. Over and over, the crews practiced until the rumble of engines and the rush of acceleration became second nature. The B-25Bs themselves were undergoing transformations that blurred the line between bomber and endurance racer. At Minneapolis's Wold Chamberlain Field, modifications were made under Doolittle's direct supervision. Additional fuel tanks were fitted into the bomb bay, the crawlway, and even the space where the lower turret had been, bringing total fuel capacity to over 1,100 gallons. Armament was reduced to lighten the aircraft. The dorsal turret was retained, but the ventral turret was removed entirely. To discourage enemy fighters from approaching the tail, 2 broomsticks were painted black and mounted to resemble machine guns. Bomb loads were tailored for both message and effect. Each aircraft would carry 4 bombs, 3 500-pound high explosives, and 1 incendiary cluster. Targets were carefully chosen for their military value and their symbolic weight: factories, shipyards, oil storage facilities. Doolittle insisted that civilian casualties be minimized, directing crews to strike industrial areas and avoid residential zones. Navigation training was equally critical. The bombers would have no fighter escort and no homing beacons once launched. Pilots and navigators drilled in dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and the use of drift meters to correct for wind over open ocean. The goal was to strike their targets in daylight, then fly on to friendly, or at least Allied-controlled, airfields in China. That friendly label, however, was deceptive. Large swaths of eastern China were under Japanese occupation, and the route ahead was riddled with hazards. To build endurance for the long flight, crews undertook extended training missions over the Gulf of Mexico, simulating the non-stop legs they would face. Low-level approaches were practiced to reduce exposure to radar and anti-aircraft fire. Gunners rehearsed quick target acquisition with the reduced defensive armament. Each crewman's role was honed until it could be executed under exhaustion and stress. In the evenings, the men returned to the barracks, swapping speculation in low voices. Some guessed their target was a German outpost in North Africa. Others thought perhaps they would be striking an island in the Central Pacific. Doolittle offered no confirmation. "You'll know when you need to know," he would say with a faint smile. The physical demands were matched by the mental strain of operating under such secrecy. Mail was censored, movements restricted. Even at Eglin, where experimental projects were not uncommon, the sight of B-25s practicing impossibly short takeoffs drew curiosity. The crews learned to deflect questions, to keep their purpose locked away. By mid-March, the transformation was nearly complete. The men had mastered the carrier takeoff profile. Their aircraft were fitted with every modification that could give them an extra mile of range, and their skills had been sharpened for the strike to come. Now came the transition from land to sea. On March 25th, the first of the modified B-25s began their journey north to McClellan Field, California, for final checks. From there, they would fly to the Alameda Naval Air Station on San Francisco Bay. Alameda was the Hornets' home port, and it was here, under gray coastal skies, that the crews first saw the ship that would carry them toward their target. The sight was enough to silence even the most talkative among them. The Hornet's flight deck was bare of the Navy's usual air group. Instead, its wooden planking was already being marked for the placement of 16 Army bombers. Cranes hoisted the B-25s aboard, their landing gear swinging as sailors guided them into position. For the carrier's crew, the operation was an oddity. Most had never seen an Army bomber up close, much less on their ship's deck. The sailors looked over the unfamiliar aircraft, ran their hands along the smooth olive-drab fuselages, and shook their heads. Many doubted the planes could even take off from the short deck, let alone reach Japan. Below decks, space was tight. Bomber crews and Navy personnel shared mess halls, passageways, and quarters. The mingling of services, Army Air Forces officers in khaki, Navy sailors in blue, was a rare sight in 1942. It fostered a quiet camaraderie, as both groups understood they were part of something extraordinary. In these final days before departure, Doolittle reviewed his crews with a critical eye. He moved among them during inspections, checked modifications personally, and offered terse but encouraging words. To one crewman concerned about fuel, he said simply, "We'll make it." To another, worried about the possibility of capture, Doolittle replied, "We'll be gone before they know we're there." As April approached, weather reports and intelligence updates became the focus. Japanese patrol patterns, ocean currents, and even seasonal winds over China were factored into the launch calculations. The mission depended on precise timing. The bombers had to reach Japan in daylight for accuracy, yet still have enough time to fly onto China before nightfall. On April 1st, with the last preparations complete, the crews boarded the Hornet. Lines were cast off at Alameda on April 2nd, and the ship slid silently into the channel, her unusual cargo drawing curious glances from those ashore. Once past the Golden Gate, she joined the rest of Task Force 16, led by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey aboard USS Enterprise. In the coming days, the task force would plunge deep into waters patrolled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The training at Eglin, the modifications in Minneapolis, the secrecy and the speculation, all of it had been in service of a single moment. 16 bombers lifting into the Pacific sky from a deck never meant for them, to strike at the heart of the empire that had dared to attack Pearl Harbor. The men were ready. Whether the plan was truly possible, they would soon find out. On the morning of April 2nd, 1942, the USS Hornet eased away from her berth at Alameda Naval Air Station, her massive hull gliding past the piers with deliberate power. The early fog off San Francisco Bay clung low over the water, softening the outlines of the Golden Gate Bridge. Lines were cast off in silence, the rumble of the carrier's turbines muffled beneath the slap of wavelets against her hull. For most of the civilians watching from the shoreline, the sight was puzzling. The Hornet's flight deck, normally lined with the squat silhouettes of Navy fighters and bombers, now bristled with 16 long-winged twin-engine aircraft, Army B-25 Mitchells, lashed down in neat rows. Few could guess that these ungainly visitors to a carrier's deck were bound for one of the most audacious missions of the war. As the Hornet cleared the bay and turned west into the open Pacific, the men of Task Force 16 began to settle into a new rhythm. The Hornet's captain, Mark A. Mitcher, maintained a steady speed, her prow cutting through the cold swells with disciplined precision. The ship's escorts, 2 heavy cruisers, 4 destroyers, and the fleet oiler Cimarron took up station around her, each moving in concert to protect the carrier at the heart of the formation. The Hornet was not alone in this venture. Waiting just beyond the horizon was Vice Admiral William F. Halsey's flagship, the veteran carrier USS Enterprise, accompanied by her own screen of cruisers and destroyers. The Enterprise had her full complement of aircraft: F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo planes, ready to defend the task force. In the carefully choreographed plan, the Hornet would carry only the B-25s. The Enterprise's air group would provide fighter cover during the approach to Japan. For the first time in the Pacific War, two American carriers would sail together in a combined strike force. Secrecy remained paramount. The crews of both carriers were under strict orders. No mention of the mission's details in letters, no discussion outside of essential duties. Even among the Hornet's own sailors, speculation ran rampant. Some believed the bombers were destined for Hawaii or Alaska. Others guessed at an attack on some remote Pacific outpost. Only a handful of senior officers knew the truth, that their goal lay more than 5,000 miles away, across some of the most heavily patrolled waters in the world. Life aboard settled into the routines of a long sea voyage, but always with the undercurrent of anticipation. The Army air crews, strangers to the tight quarters of a warship, adapted to the constant vibration of the turbines and the ever-present roll of the deck. They shared mess tables with Navy personnel, swapped stories in the cramped ready rooms, and joined in daily maintenance on their aircraft. The salt-laden air was harsher than anything the Mitchells had experienced on land. Protective covers were kept on engines and sensitive equipment, while crews inspected the lashings daily to ensure the bombers stayed secure in heavy seas. In the evenings, the task force pressed on at an average of 20 knots, the carrier's wakes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lookouts scanned the horizon for enemy vessels or aircraft. The Pacific, vast as it was, could not guarantee safety. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained long chains of patrol boats and reconnaissance aircraft along probable approach routes to the home islands. During the day, the Enterprise's scouts fanned out to reconnoiter ahead of the task force, while her fighters flew combat air patrol overhead. The B-25 crews joined in shipboard drills, practicing damage control, manning anti-aircraft guns, and running through emergency procedures for launch. Though no B-25 would return to the Hornet once airborne, the discipline of naval life quickly took hold. Everyone aboard knew that the enemy could appear without warning. In the wardroom, Doolittle kept his briefings focused and sparse. He spoke in generalities, discussing navigation techniques and bomb release procedures, but offered no firm confirmation of their targets. When asked directly, he would smile slightly and change the subject. Yet the closer they steamed toward Japanese waters, the more the men guessed the truth. On April 12th, the task force crossed the international date line. They were now deep in enemy territory, far beyond the normal operational range of American carrier groups. Each day brought them closer to the critical launch point, calculated to place the bombers within striking range of Tokyo, while still allowing enough fuel to reach the airfields in China. Weather played its own part in the voyage. Low clouds and occasional rain squalls helped conceal the task force from aerial reconnaissance, but also made navigation and deck operations more difficult. Mitcher and Halsey maintained strict radio silence. Signals were passed visually or through signal lamps between ships. By April 16th, they were just over 1,000 nautical miles from Japan. Tension was mounting. The crews knew that the danger would multiply once they crossed into the patrol zones east of the home islands. Japanese picket boats, converted fishing trawlers, and small naval craft were stationed in overlapping arcs, their radio transmitters ready to warn of any approaching threat. To slip past them undetected was the task force's greatest challenge in these final days. That night, as the ships plowed on under a moonless sky, the men went through their final preparations. The B-25 crews checked fuel lines, calibrated bomb sites, and secured maps in their cockpits. Each pilot was issued silk escape maps of China, small-caliber pistols, and survival rations. The sailors, too, readied for action. Anti-aircraft batteries were manned. Lookouts doubled. On April 17th, the task force entered the high-risk zone. Halsey's plan was to approach to within roughly 450 nautical miles of Japan by the following morning, launch the bombers at first light, and then turn the carriers east at maximum speed. The success of the mission depended on those final hours going according to plan. Yet the Pacific had other ideas. Just before dawn on April 18th, the Hornet's lookouts spotted a speck on the horizon, a small vessel, its silhouette unmistakable to veteran sailors. It was one of the Japanese picket boats, part of the early warning network. The alarm spread quickly through the task force. A cruiser moved to intercept, and within minutes the distant thump of her guns echoed across the water. The vessel was sunk, but not before she transmitted a warning. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Halsey and Doolittle conferred. The situation was clear. Their presence was almost certainly known to the Japanese. If they continued on to the planned launch point, they risked interception by enemy surface forces or air attack. But launching now, more than 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, would push the B-25's range to its absolute limits, making it unlikely that any would reach China. It was a choice between risk and ruin. Halsey sent a message to the Hornet. Launch planes, to Colonel Doolittle and Gallant Command. Good luck and God bless you. Dawn, April 18th, 1942. The Pacific stretched in every direction, a pale, heaving expanse under a sky streaked with the first light of day. The air was cold, the wind steady from the west. For hours, the task force had been driving hard toward the planned launch point. The twin carriers Hornet and Enterprise at the center of a tight ring of cruisers and destroyers. Then, just after 07:30, the calm broke. A sharp voice crackled over the Hornet's internal communications. Small surface contact, bearing green 25, range 8 miles. On the bridge, Captain Mark Mitcher raised his binoculars. Through the haze, the shape resolved, low in the water, with a thin mast and a squat superstructure aft. A Japanese picket boat. Within seconds, more details became clear. The vessel was painted a dull gray, and her stern housed a radio aerial already taut with an active signal. Mitcher knew what that meant. This was no random fishing craft. It was a patrol from the Japanese 26th Guard Force, part of an early warning net strung like a picket fence hundreds of miles from the home islands. Orders moved fast. The nearest escort, the cruiser USS Nashville, swung out of formation, her 6-inch guns finding range. The Nito Maru, as it would later be identified, tried to turn away, her engine churning a froth of white wake. But at that distance, she was a small target against the swell. Salvo after salvo landed closer, until one shell found its mark, tearing into the picket boat's hull. Moments later, a geyser of spray marked the impact of another. The Japanese craft rolled hard, smoke pouring from her stern, and began to settle in the water. The Nashville closed in, her guns still firing. In minutes, the picket boat was gone, slipping beneath the waves, her crew clinging to debris. But the damage had been done. Before the Nito Maru sank, she had broadcast a contact report, giving bearing, estimated speed, and composition. Enemy task force sighted, including carrier. On the Enterprise's flag bridge, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey's jaw tightened. The plan called for launching the bombers roughly 450 nautical miles from Japan, to give them the best chance of reaching airfields in eastern China. At this moment, they were still more than 650 nautical miles from Tokyo. That extra 200 miles would consume every gallon of reserve fuel the B-25s carried. Even in perfect weather, the odds of reaching China were now slim. But Halsey knew the Japanese reaction would be swift. Surface forces from the home islands could be dispatched to intercept. Worse, land-based bombers from the coast might find and strike the carriers before the launch. Doolittle was summoned to the bridge. He arrived in full flight gear, his parachute slung over one shoulder, his face composed but alert. Halsey outlined the situation in clipped sentences. Early detection, compromised approach, a decision point. The choice was stark. If they pressed on to the planned launch point, the risk to the task force and to the mission grew with every mile. If they launched now, the bombers might not have enough fuel to reach safety. Doolittle did not hesitate. "We'll launch now, Admiral," he said. "If necessary, we'll make it to the coast and bail out." Halsey nodded once. The decision was made. A message flashed to the Hornet. "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command. Good luck and God bless you." The order rippled through the Hornet like a current. In the ready rooms below deck, crews sprang to their feet. Navigators folded charts, gunners strapped on sidearms, pilots zipped up flight jackets. On the hangar deck, the elevators clattered as the last of the bombers were brought topside, their olive-drab fuselages gleaming in the morning light. On deck, the wind carried the scent of salt and fuel. Sailors swarmed around each B-25, untying lashings, checking tire pressures, and securing bomb bay doors. The wooden planking beneath their boots was slick with spray. Every movement had to be sure, deliberate. The Hornet's deck crews, veterans of countless Navy launch operations, had never done anything like this. These planes were heavier, longer, and far less agile than any carrier aircraft. The margin for error was razor thin. Mitcher ordered the ship turned into the wind, her turbines driving at full speed. The Hornet's bow bit into the swells, sending spray curling over the forward deck. The apparent wind over the deck now reached over 40 knots, a crucial factor in giving the bombers the lift they needed. At 08:20, the first aircraft was rolled into position. This was Doolittle's own B-25, tail number 402344. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and ran through the checklist with his co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard E. Cole. The engines growled to life, the propellers carving shimmering discs in the air. Ahead, the painted white line marked the center of the takeoff path. Beyond it, only the gray-green Pacific. The launch officer crouched low, scanning the deck, then raised his flag. Doolittle advanced the throttles to maximum, the Wright R-2600 engines straining against the brakes. The roar built to a pounding vibration that echoed through the deck. On the signal, he released the brakes. The bomber surged forward, tail lifting almost immediately. Spray exploded upward as the Hornet pitched into a trough. The deck ahead seemed to vanish for an instant. At the edge, the B-25's wheels left the planking, dipping toward the sea before the wings bit into the wind and lifted her skyward. Cheers erupted from the deck crews as Doolittle's plane climbed away, banking eastward toward the enemy coast. One by one, the other bombers followed. Pilots timed their runs to the ship's motion, releasing brakes just as the bow rose to meet a swell. The deck crew worked with mechanical precision. Chocks pulled, lashings cleared, signal flags dropped. At times, the gap between aircraft was little more than the minutes needed to roll the next into place. The second plane, flown by Lieutenant Travis Hoover, rumbled down the deck and lifted away cleanly. Then the third, the fourth. Some pilots held their breath as the ocean rushed up toward them in those first seconds after leaving the deck, the extra fuel tanks making the Mitchells sluggish to climb. But each one found the lift they needed. From the Enterprise, fighter pilots circled overhead, watching the launch unfold. Below, the destroyers maintained their protective screen, alert for any sign of Japanese aircraft or warships. Every man on every ship knew they were now inside the danger zone. By 0919, the last bomber, Lieutenant William Farrows, was airborne. 16 aircraft were now strung out in a long, thin line over the Pacific, each flying its own carefully calculated course toward the Japanese coast. They flew low to stay beneath enemy radar, the pale surface of the ocean sliding past below them. For the men left aboard the carriers, the tension shifted. The bombers were gone. Their fate now lay beyond the horizon. Mitcher and Halsey turned their attention to the escape. The carriers swung east, increasing to flank speed, their wakes frothing behind them. If Japanese surface forces had been dispatched, every knot would count in the race to safety. In the cockpits of the B-25s, the crews settled into the long haul. Fuel consumption was watched obsessively. Throttles were eased, propeller pitch adjusted for maximum economy. The navigators kept their eyes on compasses and charts, making constant corrections. Over the intercom, voices were steady but terse. Every man knew that even if they reached Japan, the hardest part, finding China with enough fuel to land, still lay ahead. Behind them, somewhere beyond the curve of the Earth, the wreckage of the Nito Maru drifted on the waves, its crew scattered across the water. In Tokyo, coastal radio stations were already relaying her final transmission. The Japanese High Command had been warned. What they would do with that warning, the raiders could not know. But for now, 16 American bombers were in the air, the first hostile aircraft to approach the Japanese homeland in living memory. The day's gamble had begun in earnest. For more than 3 hours after leaving the Hornet, the 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers pressed on, low over the endless Pacific. Their engines droned steadily, the pale surface of the water sliding beneath them in a ceaseless blur. The men kept their eyes on fuel gauges and compasses, making tiny adjustments to squeeze every possible mile from their tanks. Each crew knew the margin was razor thin. The early launch meant that every gallon, every minute of engine time would matter. The weather held fair as they approached the Japanese coast. High, thin clouds, visibility stretching far to the horizon. At about 12:15 local time, the first outlines of land began to rise ahead. Japan. For the first time in history, American combat aircraft had crossed the Pacific to reach these shores. Colonel James H. Doolittle, in the lead bomber, brought his aircraft slightly higher, scanning for landmarks. The plan was for each crew to approach their assigned target on a staggered schedule, striking nearly simultaneously across 4 major cities: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. This dispersion would confuse Japanese defenses, forcing them to spread out their already limited anti-aircraft resources. Doolittle's target lay in the capital itself, an industrial district of Tokyo with multiple military supply factories. He and his crew approached from the east, skimming low over the coastal plain. Below, startled fishermen pointed upward, their boats rocking in the bombers' wake. As they crossed into the city, the first wail of air raid sirens rose, a sound that, in April 1942, was alien to most Tokyo residents. The Japanese home islands had been untouched by enemy air attack for centuries. Many civilians had never even imagined hostile planes over their capital. People looked skyward from trams, factory yards, and open markets. For a few seconds, there was confusion. These planes were not Japanese. Then the first black bursts of anti-aircraft fire cracked overhead. Doolittle lined up on his aiming point. At 1,500 feet, his bombardier, Sergeant Fred A. Bramer, toggled the release. 4 bombs tumbled free, their fins spinning as they fell. A heartbeat later, the ground shook with the impact. 2 explosions tearing through a military supply warehouse, another smashing into a nearby factory, and the incendiary cluster igniting a blaze that sent thick black smoke curling upward. Pulling hard on the yoke, Doolittle banked away to the southwest, engines roaring as they clawed for speed. Far to the south, Lieutenant Travis Hoover's bomber closed in on Yokohama. His target, oil storage tanks along the waterfront, and a shipyard producing auxiliary naval vessels. Coming in low over the bay, Hoover's crew released their bombs in a tight pattern. The oil tanks erupted in sheets of flame, the blast hurling fragments into the water. Japanese gunners opened up from the docks, their tracers streaking upward. But Hoover's Mitchell held steady until the last bomb was away. Then, throttles wide open, they turned west toward the interior. Over Nagoya, Captain David M. Jones found heavier resistance. The city was an important manufacturing hub, home to aircraft assembly plants and machine works. Japanese anti-aircraft crews, alerted by reports from coastal observers, were ready. Flak burst close enough to rattle the bomber's fuselage, and several rounds punched jagged holes in the tail section. But Jones's bombardier dropped on target, scoring hits on an aircraft plant and setting a warehouse ablaze. In Kobe, Captain Ross Greening's crew came in low and fast, skirting the harbor before banking sharply toward a cluster of industrial facilities. Their bombs struck a steelworks and a nearby power station, the explosions visible for miles. As they turned for the open sea, Greening spotted a Japanese fighter, a single Nakajima Ki-27, angling in from above. With only 2 50 caliber machine guns in the dorsal turret and mock guns in the tail, the Mitchell was no match for a determined interceptor. But luck held. The fighter made only one pass before breaking off, perhaps low on fuel or unwilling to chase the bomber far from shore. In Tokyo, other crews found themselves threading between bursts of flak and the rising columns of smoke from earlier strikes. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, flying just behind Doolittle's group, later recalled the surreal clarity of the city below. "We came in so low we could see the laundry hanging on rooftops. Then we were over the target, and the bombs were gone, and all at once it seemed every gun in Tokyo was shooting at us." On the ground, the Japanese military reacted with urgency but not precision. The early warning picket boats had provided only minutes of advance notice, and the scattered approach of the bombers meant that air defenses struggled to concentrate. Fighters scrambled from nearby fields, but few made contact. Anti-aircraft gunners, many unaccustomed to tracking fast, medium-altitude targets, fired erratically. In several cities, civilians assumed at first that the bombers were part of a training exercise, only realizing the truth when explosions began to tear through industrial areas. Though the physical damage was limited, fewer than 50 structures destroyed or seriously damaged across all targets, the psychological effect was profound. Fires rose over Tokyo's waterfront. In Yokohama, plumes of oily smoke drifted over the bay. In Kobe and Nagoya, industrial workers fled factories as air raid sirens wailed without pause. For the first time since the start of the Pacific War, Japan's population could look skyward and see the enemy over their own streets. By 12:30 p.m., most of the bombers had completed their attack runs and turned southwest. The second phase of their journey now began, the long, fuel-starved dash toward China. Navigators plotted courses that would take them across the East China Sea and over the coast, aiming for friendly airfields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. But even as they left the Japanese coast behind, new challenges emerged. Weather began to close in. A front moving across eastern China was bringing low clouds and rain, obscuring landmarks and making navigation by sight nearly impossible. For crews already stretching their fuel to the limit, any deviation could be fatal. Over the intercoms, pilots kept their voices even, but everyone understood the stakes. In Doolittle's aircraft, the crew calculated they would reach the Chinese coast after nightfall. That meant they would have to rely on dead reckoning for the final approach. No radio beacons, no lights, only the compass and the clock. As the hours wore on, fuel gauges dropped steadily toward empty. Lieutenant Lawson's bomber, low on fuel earlier than expected, was buffeted by turbulence as they crossed the coast. Unable to find a safe landing strip, Lawson ordered his crew to brace for a ditching. Moments later, the B-25 struck the water in a spray of foam, the impact tearing off the nose section. All aboard survived, but Lawson suffered severe leg injuries that would later cost him part of his limb. Other crews faced equally perilous endings. Some bailed out into darkness over rugged hills, their parachutes snapping open in the cold night air. A few landed safely at friendly Chinese airfields. Others came down in Japanese-held territory and were quickly captured. In all, of the 16 bombers, 15 reached China. One, piloted by Captain Edward York, was forced to divert to the Soviet Union due to fuel shortage and landed there, where the crew was interned. Of the 80 men who took off from the Hornet, 3 were killed in action during the mission, and 8 became prisoners of war. Among the captured, 3 would be executed by the Japanese after a sham trial. 1 would die in captivity. The Japanese reaction on the ground was swift and brutal. In the coastal provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, where American airmen had been aided by Chinese civilians, the Imperial Army launched massive reprisal operations. Entire villages were destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in what became known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. A grim reminder that even a daring raid could carry a terrible cost for those caught in its wake. Yet for the raiders, in the hours immediately after the attack, the dominant feeling was relief. Against formidable odds, they had reached Japan, struck their targets, and escaped the home islands. Whether they would survive the journey to China was another question. But the first, most dangerous part of their mission was complete. In Tokyo, the damage reports began arriving at Imperial General Headquarters. Physically, the losses were manageable. Strategically, they were a shock. The very fact that American bombers had reached Japan was a humiliation for the military leadership, particularly for Admiral Yamamoto and the Imperial Navy. For years, the Japanese public had been told their islands were impregnable. Now, with smoke still rising over their cities, that myth had been shattered in a single day. For the United States, the news would take days to filter back through military channels, and longer still before the public would hear of it. But when they did, the Doolittle raid would become a rallying point, a symbol of defiance after the dark months following Pearl Harbor. By nightfall on April 18th, the raiders were scattered across hundreds of miles, their fuel tanks nearly dry, their fates uncertain. Some were already walking through rain-soaked fields in China, guided by villagers toward safety. Others lay hidden in barns or mountain huts, evading Japanese patrols. Still others were beginning the long ordeal of captivity. But for all of them, the image of Japan's cities sliding beneath their wings, smoke curling upward into the spring sky, would remain fixed in memory for the rest of their lives. By early afternoon on April 18, 1942, the 16 B-25s had left the Japanese coast behind, their bomb bays empty, their noses now pointed southwest toward China. The first rush of adrenaline from the attack had passed, replaced by the steady thrum of engines and the quiet calculations of survival. Every crew knew they were now on the second, and far more uncertain, leg of the mission. Fuel was the central concern. The early launch had added more than 200 miles to the route, and even with the added tanks and careful engine management, there was no margin left. Pilots trimmed their aircraft to the finest degree, throttling back just enough to conserve fuel without sacrificing precious airspeed. Navigators hunched over their maps, calculating headings by dead reckoning, their pencils marking lines over a blank gray sea. For hours, the East China Sea stretched below them, featureless and cold. The weather began to shift. A low bank of clouds appeared ahead, thickening with each mile. By mid-afternoon, the bombers were flying into a haze that dulled the sun and flattened the horizon. Soon after, rain began to patter against the windshields, streaking the glass and reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. By dusk, the weather had closed in completely. The crews were flying blind into solid overcast, trusting only to instruments and compass bearings. Without radio beacons to guide them, they relied on estimated position and hope. The mission plan had always called for reaching Chinese territory in daylight. Now, the loss of speed from fuel conservation and the detour forced by the early launch meant they would be arriving in darkness over unfamiliar and often mountainous terrain. In Doolittle's lead aircraft, the cockpit was lit only by the dim glow of the instrument panel. He glanced at the fuel gauges. Both needles were edging toward empty. Speaking over the intercom, he told his crew to prepare for bailout. Each man checked his parachute harness, his pistol, and the small survival kit strapped to his gear. No one spoke of the possibility of landing. The darkness and worsening weather made that nearly impossible. One by one, the bombers began to run dry. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's ruptured duck was among the first to falter. With engines sputtering, Lawson aimed for what he thought was a flat stretch of ground in the gloom. At the last moment, he realized it was water. The bomber slammed into the sea, nose first, the impact shearing off the forward section and throwing Lawson against the instrument panel. Stunned and bleeding, he struggled to the surface alongside his crew. They clung to the wing until Chinese fishermen pulled them from the freezing water. Lawson's leg injuries were severe, and he would later lose part of his limb. Elsewhere, crews chose the only option left, parachuting into the night. Bomb bays were opened, and men dropped one by one into the rushing black air, their chutes snapping open above them. The descent was disorienting. The wind howled in their ears, and rain stung their faces. Many landed hard, striking trees, rocks, or uneven fields. Broken ankles, fractured ribs, and deep cuts were common. Those who survived the landings faced an immediate question. Where were they? Much of eastern China was under Japanese occupation. In the darkness, there was no way to tell whether the lights of a distant village meant rescue or capture. Some hid in ditches or groves until daylight, shivering in the damp cold. Others moved cautiously toward habitation, hoping to find friendly Chinese civilians. For a few crews, fortune intervened quickly. Villagers, risking death if discovered aiding the Americans, approached cautiously, offering food, dry clothing, and directions toward nationalist-held areas. The Chinese resistance network, though strained by years of occupation, moved swiftly to conceal the airmen and guide them toward safety. But not all were so lucky. Several raiders came down in territory, patrolled by Japanese troops. Within hours, search parties fanned out, and some of the Americans were captured. For these men, the mission's dangers had only begun. By the early hours of April 19th, the scattered remnants of the raid were spread across hundreds of miles, some sheltering in farmhouses or mountain huts, others limping toward the next village, still others already bound in Japanese custody. The cost was visible: injuries from bailouts and crashes, frostbite from exposure, and the lingering uncertainty of whether their mission would even be known to those back home. Yet, in the minds of many, there was also the quiet knowledge that they had struck the Japanese homeland and escaped its shores. Whatever the outcome now, the impossible had been done. In the first light of April 19, 1942, the raiders who had survived their crash landings and bailouts began to take stock of their surroundings. For some, fortune took the form of figures emerging from the morning mist, Chinese villagers, moving quickly and quietly, their faces lined with caution. Word had already spread along hidden paths. Foreign airmen had fallen from the sky, and the Japanese patrols would soon be searching. In Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, much of the countryside was under occupation, but the loyalty of many rural communities lay firmly with the Chinese nationalist government and the underground resistance. These villagers knew the penalty for aiding Americans: death for themselves and their families, yet they acted without hesitation. The airmen were brought into farmhouses, given dry clothing and bowls of hot rice, and hidden in lofts, barns, or even underground storage pits when Japanese troops approached. Guerrilla fighters and resistance organizers soon took charge, moving the Americans from one safe location to the next, often under cover of night. Guides led them along narrow mountain trails, across rivers by concealed ferries, and through fields planted with early spring crops. Along the way, they passed warnings from hamlet to hamlet: Japanese patrols on the road ahead, troops searching villages, enemy aircraft circling low. Each move was a gamble, each hiding place a potential trap. For many crews, this network of quiet bravery meant eventual escape to Chongqing, the wartime capital of nationalist China. There, weeks or months later, they would be reunited with fellow raiders and finally make contact with U.S. authorities. But for several men, the outcome was starkly different. 8 airmen, captured after landing in or drifting into Japanese-held zones, were quickly bound and taken to military garrisons. Among them were Lieutenants Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Robert Metter, along with several enlisted crewmen. Interrogations began almost immediately. The Japanese, humiliated by the raid, sought not just information about the mission, but confessions they could use for propaganda. The prisoners were questioned for hours, denied adequate food, and subjected to threats of execution. When answers did not come, the beatings began. Blows from rifle butts, kicks, and slaps. In some cases, Prisoners were displayed before civilian crowds, their presence meant to show that the empire's enemies could be captured and humiliated. By October 1942, the Japanese convened a public military trial in Shanghai for the captured raiders. The verdict was predetermined. All were sentenced to death, but in a calculated gesture aimed at portraying mercy, 5 had their sentences commuted to life in prison. The other 3, Hallmark, Farrow, and Harold Spatz, were taken to a public square, blindfolded, and executed by firing squad. The remaining 5 endured years of brutal captivity. One, Robert Mader, would die of disease in 1943. Only 4 lived to see liberation in August 1945. The cost of the Doolittle raid did not fall on the airmen alone. In the weeks after the attack, the Japanese military launched a massive punitive campaign against Chinese civilians in the regions where the Americans had landed. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, as it became known, was an operation of reprisal and intimidation. Japanese troops swept through hundreds of villages, searching for anyone suspected of aiding the Americans. Entire communities were burned to the ground. Men, women, and children were executed without trial. Food stores were destroyed, wells poisoned, and livestock slaughtered. Infected grain and clothing were distributed deliberately as part of a germ warfare effort orchestrated by the infamous Unit 731. Chinese government records and post-war testimony estimated that as many as 250,000 civilians were killed during the campaign, most with no direct connection to the raiders. The Japanese goal was clear: to sever the bond between the population and the resistance, and to make the cost of helping Allied forces unthinkably high. For the survivors of the raid who made it to safety, the knowledge of these reprisals would weigh heavily in the years that followed. Doolittle himself, in later interviews, spoke of the pride he felt in his men and the mission's achievement, but also of his sorrow for the suffering it brought to the Chinese people who had risked everything to help them. In the spring of 1942, though, those who were still in hiding had little time for reflection. Survival depended on the next move, the next safe house, the next group of villagers willing to defy the occupation. The Doolittle raid had begun as a daring strike against the Japanese homeland. In its aftermath, it became a test of endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice, not only for the Americans who flew it, but for the countless Chinese civilians whose courage and suffering became an inseparable part of its story. In the days and weeks after April 18, 1942, the Doolittle raiders began to trickle back into American hands, not as a single triumphant unit, but in fragments. Some arrived from China by long, winding routes through Allied-held Asia. Others emerged from months of recuperation in field hospitals, their injuries still fresh reminders of crash landings and bailouts. A few would never return at all, their absence marked by brief, solemn telegrams to families. Back in Washington, the raid's success was being shaped into a weapon of its own, a weapon of morale. By late April, word had reached the capital that American bombers had struck the Japanese homeland. Exact details were scarce. The mission had been so secret that even high-ranking officers outside the planning circle knew little. President Franklin Roosevelt seized the moment. At a press conference, when asked from where the bombers had launched, he smiled and replied simply, "Shangri-La," a playful reference to the fictional Himalayan paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The quip masked the truth while adding a layer of mystique that gripped the public imagination. Across the country, newspapers blared the headlines: Tokyo bombed by U.S. Army planes. For a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, the effect was electric. Editorials spoke of America's answer and the first blow. Radio commentators described the raid as the turning of the tide, a proof that the Pacific was not wholly the enemy's domain. Few readers knew the cost, or the dangers still faced by crews scattered across Asia. When the surviving raiders finally returned to U.S. soil, many months later, they were greeted as heroes. Parades were organized in cities from Washington to Los Angeles. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, straining for a glimpse of the men who had taken the war to Tokyo. In uniform, they smiled, waved, and endured the speeches. Yet behind the cheers, many carried the quiet weight of their journey. The friends left behind, the injuries, the faces of Chinese villagers who had risked everything to help them escape. Doolittle himself was perhaps the most conflicted of all. He had expected to be court-martialed upon his return, convinced that the loss of all 16 aircraft, none had reached their intended recovery bases, would be judged a failure. Instead, Roosevelt summoned him to the White House. In a brief but memorable ceremony, the president placed the Medal of Honor around Doolittle's neck. The citation praised his conspicuous leadership and gallantry in action, calling the raid a daring and courageous attack that had demonstrated that our American forces can strike wherever they choose. Doolittle accepted with characteristic modesty, later remarking that he wore it on behalf of all his men. The War Department and the press understood the propaganda value of the raid. Photographs of the crews, often staged with maps or model bombers, circulated widely. War bond rallies featured raiders as honored guests. Newsreels played footage of B-25s on carrier decks, carefully edited to hide operational details. The message was consistent. America had carried the fight to Japan, and it could do so again. But away from the podiums and parades, the private realities persisted. Some raiders struggled with lingering injuries that would end their flying careers. Others were haunted by the fate of captured comrades, whose deaths in Japanese custody would only be confirmed after the war. Many kept silent about the reprisals against Chinese civilians, though the knowledge weighed heavily. In reunion gatherings years later, these subjects would surface quietly among the men, acknowledged with solemn nods rather than speeches. Still, the raid's impact on the American home front was undeniable. It had arrived at a moment when Allied news was grim, when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. By proving that the enemy's home islands were not beyond reach, the raid bolstered confidence at every level, from the factory worker riveting fuselages in Detroit to the sailor standing watch on a destroyer in the Coral Sea. In the months that followed, the phrase, "Remember the Doolittle Raiders," became shorthand for the kind of daring and resolve the nation sought to embody. Roosevelt's offhand Shangri-La would echo for years, even lending its name to a new Essex-class carrier launched in 1944. For the raiders themselves, the homecoming was both a celebration and a reminder. They had accomplished what many had thought impossible, but they had also paid a price measured in lives, injuries, and the suffering of those who had sheltered them. In the balance of victory and cost, they carried both, quietly and for the rest of their days. In Tokyo, the first reports of the April 18th raid arrived not as a coherent dispatch, but as a series of alarming fragments. Unidentified twin-engine bombers sighted over the capital, explosions in Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, fires in multiple industrial districts. For the Imperial General Headquarters, the news was a shock. The Japanese public had been assured repeatedly that the home islands were impregnable. Now, with smoke still rising from their cities, that confidence had been shattered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood the damage was far greater than the physical destruction. By any measure, the raid's bomb damage was limited. But its psychological impact was enormous. It exposed gaps in Japan's early warning system, revealed the reach of American power, and suggested that the Pacific barrier on which their defense rested was far more porous than believed. In the war councils that followed, Army and Navy leaders agreed on one point: the humiliation had to be avenged, and swiftly. The Japanese public had to be reassured, and the United States had to be reminded that such a strike could not be repeated without dire consequences. This urgency gave new momentum to an operation Yamamoto had already been advocating, an ambitious plan to lure America's remaining carriers into a decisive battle. That operation was aimed at Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. From Midway, American long-range patrols could threaten Japan's outer defensive perimeter. Yamamoto's concept was to seize the atoll, drawing the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap. There, under the guns and aircraft of the combined fleet, the American carriers would be destroyed, giving Japan uncontested control of the Central Pacific. Before April 18th, the Midway Plan had met with resistance from elements within the Naval General Staff, who favored consolidating Japan's gains in the South. But the Doolittle raid changed the calculus overnight. The very fact that U.S. carriers had approached close enough to launch medium bombers at Japan demonstrated the threat they posed. Eliminating those carriers now became a matter of national urgency. Yamamoto argued that only an aggressive offensive could restore Japan's strategic advantage and public confidence. The Naval General Staff relented. Orders went out to accelerate the timetable. The combined fleet began assembling a massive armada. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a separate invasion force. The plan was complex, involving diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands to split U.S. forces, while the main body struck at Midway. Yamamoto believed the Americans would respond predictably, rushing their carriers to defend the atoll. There, the Japanese would crush them in a battle modeled on their victory at Pearl Harbor. But beneath the confidence lay a dangerous miscalculation. The raid on Tokyo had convinced Japan's leadership that the U.S. carriers were bold but vulnerable, that their crews could be drawn into a fight on Japanese terms. What they did not know was that American codebreakers had already penetrated portions of the Japanese naval cipher, giving Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, advance warning of the Midway operation. The Doolittle raid thus set in motion a chain of events that would lead directly to the pivotal battle of the Pacific War. In less than 2 months, the very carriers Yamamoto hoped to destroy would instead lie in wait for his own, turning his plan into an ambush. The same audacity that had carried B-25s over Tokyo had also spurred the overconfidence that would cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and the strategic initiative in the Pacific. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, however, the Japanese High Command could see only the insult and the political danger. For them, the answer was to strike bigger, faster, and farther. In the streets of Tokyo, propaganda posters appeared within days, vowing that the enemy would pay for his intrusion. Newspaper editorials promised that the Americans would be met with annihilation the next time they approached. The machinery of war shifted toward that goal, its gears turning toward Midway. In April 1942, the men in Japan's war rooms believed they were shaping the next great victory. They could not know that in chasing vengeance for the Doolittle raid, they were setting the stage for the most decisive defeat in their naval history. In the decades that followed the war, the Doolittle raid remained fixed in the memory of the men who flew it, and in the story, America told itself about its darkest hours. For the 80 airmen who had taken off from the deck of the Hornet that April morning in 1942, the mission was never just about the bombs dropped or the cities struck. It was about the moment the tide began, however slowly, to turn. Survival after the raid did not mean a quiet return to peacetime. Many raiders went on to fly in other theaters, enduring further danger and hardship. Some never again saw the men with whom they had shared that perilous journey. Others kept in touch through letters and occasional visits. By the late 1940s, however, a tradition began to take shape, an annual reunion of the Doolittle Raiders. These gatherings were more than social events. They were a chance to remember not only the mission, but the Chinese civilians who had aided them, and the comrades who had not returned. In 1959, a formal ritual was introduced. A set of 80 silver goblets, each engraved with the name of a raider. At each reunion, the surviving members would raise their goblets in a toast to those who had passed in the preceding year, then turn those goblets upside down in silent tribute. Over time, more and more goblets rested inverted, a silent line of absence. James Doolittle himself attended nearly every reunion until his death in 1993. He often reminded his men that the mission's success belonged to all of them equally, and that the courage of those who had not returned was what gave the raid its true meaning. The reunions became an enduring link, binding together men who had once flown across hostile seas into the heart of the enemy. Historians have continued to debate the raid's tangible impact on the war. Militarily, the damage inflicted was modest, but strategically, its effects were far-reaching. It compelled Japan to divert resources to homeland defense, altered naval priorities, and, most significantly, pushed Yamamoto toward the Midway operation. For the United States, the raid provided a crucial morale boost at a moment when defeat seemed the only news from the Pacific. Beyond strategy, the raid became a symbol of what audacity could achieve. At a time when the enemy's strength seemed overwhelming, it demonstrated that calculated risk, executed with skill and determination, could reshape the battlefield. The sight of American bombers over Tokyo shattered the illusion of Japanese invulnerability and reminded both friend and foe that the war would not be fought solely on Japan's terms. As the years passed, the number of surviving raiders dwindled. The reunions grew quieter, the rows of inverted goblets longer. Each gathering was a reminder that time was the one enemy no one could outfly. Yet the bond among the survivors remained unbroken, anchored by the shared knowledge of what they had done together on that distant April day. In 2013, the Raiders held their final public toast at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The surviving members, Richard Cole, Edward Saylor, David Thatcher, and Robert Height, stood before a table laid with all 80 goblets. In a ceremony witnessed by veterans, historians, and the families of those who had gone before, they raised their cups one last time in honor of all who had taken part. Then, with deliberate care, they inverted the goblets of their own names, leaving only those of the living upright. 2 years later, in April 2015, Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole became the last surviving Doolittle Raider. At public appearances, he spoke not of his own role, but of the team as a whole, of Doolittle's leadership, and of the Chinese villagers who had saved so many. On April 9, 2019, Cole passed away at the age of 103, closing the living chapter of the Doolittle raid's story. Today, the raid endures not only in history books and military academies, but in the collective memory of a nation that once looked to those 16 bombers as proof that the impossible could be done. The footage of their launch, B-25s rumbling down a heaving deck into the open Pacific, still carries the power to inspire. And in rare surviving film from the final reunions, we see the last raiders raising their goblets, pausing, and saluting the empty air where their comrades once stood. The Doolittle raid was born of desperation, executed with daring, and remembered with honor. It stands as a reminder that acts of courage, no matter how costly, can echo far beyond their moment in time, shaping decisions, lifting spirits, and leaving a legacy that endures long after the men who made it possible have gone.